Hello, Nina. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Oh, it's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And I do like to start these conversations with a question of what exactly does transformation mean to you?
It's a tough question, but I think ultimately transformation is that iterative journey of learning that we're all on. So it's continuing to iterate our perspectives on the world, the way that we embody experiences, and the mental models that we hold. And it iterates as we continue through life. And so it's beautiful when we can be on that journey with many other people, such as those here at this summit. So great to be here
Mm,
with you.
I love that. And one of the things when I first met you, and then I had a chance to check out your LinkedIn page, and I was like, wow, you have the coolest job title ever, Director of Societal Learning. And I'm also super curious about what exactly that means. So I'd love to unpack that here as we begin.
Yeah, so it's a role I created for myself. So part of my own transformational journey is I worked on learning within the boundaries of the organization for quite some time. And I owned the curiosity pillar of our culture transformation, which I think we'll get into a little bit.
Mhm.
But I was looking at all of the resources and capabilities and investments and amazing partners that we had available to our organization internally. And I was also looking at what we were doing externally and how a lot of our learning is focused in a specific disease area, and doesn't look at big systemic challenges. And the idea for the societal learning platform really came out of my vision that learning is the ultimate platform for bringing people together around topics and complex challenges and creating new knowledge and ideas and action and movement. And so we've named it societal learning, but really what it's a platform for is for us to create impact around certain topic areas that need to have multiple stakeholders involved across multiple institutions, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical research and development, or topics like value chain or access to medicine topics, and especially in low and middle income countries, and also how we construct compassionate health systems.
Mm. And is this, and I love this idea of learning as a platform. Is this an internal role, an internal facing function, and external facing function, working with patients, or a little bit of both? Like, how does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so I would say for me, as somebody working in a global role, I'm always really interested in how we do things at scale.
Mhm.
So the way that we actually approached this piece of work initially is to think about how to scale learning to enable the change that we want in the societies that we work with. And our initial focus was really heavily on the US because the FDA is the regulator that typically approves medicines first. And so a lot of our clinical research and development processes are governed by the US FDA. And the way that you bring diversity into the data that you're giving to the FDA is to approve new medicines, is quite complex, and the US is a huge market with a lot of challenges around health equity and around access to healthcare. So, in this situation, we brought together 26 historically Black colleges and universities, a number of other corporate partners. Over time, we've now included 6 pharmaceutical companies in this work, as well as Coursera. And The learning programs that we're delivering are really focused around enabling physicians who wouldn't normally participate in clinical research and development to actually onboard their teams into becoming clinical research and development sites so that more diverse populations can be included in that work. And then through the 26 historically Black colleges and universities, these are institutions that typically haven't received equal funding for research from government institutions such as the National Institute of Health or others who sponsor research. So it's about building up their infrastructure and capabilities and helping them to become centers of excellence in research in certain topics that especially impact African American populations. So it's not that you're reaching patients directly, but it's that you're enabling the whole system to be more diverse in the way it works and more equitable, is one example. I hope that
And
helped.
one thing that really stands out for me is just the like really you are dealing with incredible scale, and maybe you can speak a little bit about just the overall scale of how Novartis as an operating organization, and I'd love to get a little more specific about when you're looking at, say, a top level um, area like diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that stands out for me in what you're talking about is just how do you even begin to approach that? Like you mentioned, the 26 historically Black universities, and um, like when you're looking at something at that scale, partnering with that many organizations and trying to introduce some kind of learning ecosystem in that, how do you begin to um, work with that complexity in an intelligent way?
Well, first of all, I don't know if we're doing it right, but we're learning from it all the time.
That's the
So yeah,
iteration you were talking about.
yeah. Yeah, Novartis now is a company of 76,000 people,
Mm,
but that's just because a few months ago we spun off our generics division, Sandoz, which now has become the largest generics company in the world. But previously we were around floating between 105 and 110,000 people for a few years, across the entire world. And it's a scale that's really hard to fathom. So you end up using a lot of platforms, such as learning management systems, learning experience platforms to bring content to people. But we know that actually a lot of there's limits in that kind of democratized access to learning. It's really valuable, but there needs to be a feedback loop back into the organization. And so that's within the boundaries of the company, right?
mhm,
So then we've done a lot to kind of create those feedback loops, to create social learning components in all of our learning programs, and to really enable people to be learning from each other in the geographies where they're working. And a lot of that doesn't come from the learning organization necessarily. We enable that, but it's really embedded in the culture of the company. So you have the leadership at a local level, even driving a lot of those processes. And that's been a culture journey that we've been on in Novartis over a few years, where from the level of the executive committee on down, we committed to giving people access to the best learning opportunities. So that meant giving enterprise access to some of the world's leading universities on platforms like Coursera and or Harvard Medical School Online, et cetera. And then also giving people time to learn. So our executive committee made a commitment that they are an aspiration that they would like people to spend 100 hours a year, so essentially 2 hours a week of their job or their time at work dedicated to learning. And so that got embedded in the culture internally. But then when you start to bring these learning interventions also to external audiences, it's not just about delivering a training and creating some kind of um, technical skill building. You're trying to create change in systems which are adaptive. So that means that we all the time need to, again, create these feedback loops and iterate. And that really just happens through structured dialogue. So, with the 26 historically Black colleges and universities, we're about 2.5 years into the work. Some of it has progressed well, some of it not as well as or as quickly as we would like.
Mm.
And so we actually had our first convening this fall with all of those stakeholders in Washington, D.C. And I think that, yeah, similar to what you're doing now, just bringing people together in a summit or in a convening to drive the next phase of the work and of the change is incredibly effective.
So this convening is where you invited key stakeholders from each of the involved organizations to all come together into an in-person conference and basically have a bunch of conversations.
Exactly, yeah. So we had a
Mm.
lot of dialogue about what have been um, what we had achieved so far, and more importantly, what we had had in our initial planning that maybe wasn't on track, and how you can is how the stakeholders can all commit themselves to bringing the next phase of work to life. So actually, for example, um, it can be something as tactical as you have a new research center opening up at a university, but there are blocks that are happening at the level of an administration. Like, how can the whole group collectively help remove some of those blockers and creating that transparency around moving from the strategic vision of what you want to do to the actual action that needs to happen on the ground.
And I can't remember the specificity of it, but there was an example that you shared in one of your talks about something related to black skin. Can you share that example again?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the so one of the reasons that we're doing this work is that historically diverse populations just haven't been included in clinical research and development. And that means that you don't know how medicines will affect them, you don't know how diagnostic equipment will work on them. And that really became evident during the pandemic. So a lot of this work got accelerated by that. So during the pandemic, in underserved communities, you already had hospitals that were under huge stress. And the way that they triage their patients is by using oximeters to check a patient's oxygen level on their finger, the little clip that goes on your finger. And so patients with darker skin, with black and brown skin, when they came in and the oximeter was put on their finger, sometimes it would read their oxygen levels several points higher than it actually was, because in the research and development process, oximeters had never been properly tested on black and brown skin. And it was just an oversight. It was a miss because the way that those research and development processes were structured just weren't inclusive, right?
Mm.
So you had people coming in who were actually at really high risk, and they were sent home because in the process of being triaged, these hospitals, really with the best intentions, thought that they needed to save their hospital beds for somebody else. And so you had patients going home, and worst case scenario, they would pass away, but or they would have delayed treatment. And that was something that was really spoken about in the press during the pandemic and got the attention. I think for a lot of these systemic changes, it's really important that you get the attention of larger institutions and also politicians. and stories like this, and the press around it starts to really drive, the public opinion around these things, and kind of create a runway for actually getting tactical about the systemic change, right?
Mm-mm. So is that what you were earlier when you talked about um, adaptive challenges? Is that in the category of what you would consider like an adaptive learning challenge, that something is going on in the system that isn't necessarily directly visible, but then becomes more visible through some sort of research or outcome?
I guess when I think about an adaptive challenge, it's more about taking personal accountability for your role
Mm,
in systemic issues that sometimes feel too big to
mm-hmm,
be able to do anything about. And I think that's where a lot of kind of this buildup of adaptive capacity, such as being able to think systemically, to be compassionate, so different from empathetic, but being able to hold the perspectives of many different stakeholders and try to find the right resolution for multiple stakeholders without being pulled too much into one direction. That's an adaptive skill, right?
mm-hmm,
Is creating those spaces for collaboration. And then also, of course, in that, there's the need, not just your own self awareness, but your own maintaining your own capacity and energy, because in these large systemic issues, they're not ones that are going to be resolved um, quickly. So we need to have a mindset of long term thinking, and that really means also developing adaptive skills to manage your own energy.
mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
so, at least in my experience, developing adaptive skills goes a little bit beyond just content. So, how do you think about developing those skills across the ecosystem that Novartis is a part of?
So I think in Novartis, we have for a long time been recognized as investing a lot in leadership capabilities. So, which I think are essentially these adaptive skills. When it comes to doing that in the broader ecosystem in my societal learning work, I'm
Mm,
at the beginning of that journey. So, we'll do some of our first experiments this year. We have a piece of work happening in sub Saharan Africa where we're bringing a large group of people together from different countries who are decision makers in their local health system to work together on learning about health economics and outcomes research. But for me, those are very technical skills. And what's really interesting is how that group, that space, if we add in a component of, let's say, systems awareness, of compassionate leadership, of synthesizing their strategy into tactical approaches that they can share across this community, then I think that in that the adaptive skill building actually just happens in itself.
mm, mm,
So I don't like to talk about adaptive skill building to the learner. I like to just create the space for it to arise and happen, um, so that it's not, you know, our discussion about adaptive skill building is happening in the kitchen, but the restaurant experience for this community is actually more one of connection and perspective taking and problem solving, if that
mm,
makes sense.
mm. Yeah, and can you share a specific example? I mean, I heard you say that you're just at the beginning of this journey, but can you share a specific example of how of either something you've prototyped and piloted, or something that you're about to prototype or pilot?
Yeah, so that's this program that I was just talking about with this health economics program. So at the end of it, so it'll run for 9 months, and then at the end of it, we'll spend about 6 weeks actually going through learning some systems thinking tools, doing working through systems awareness maps where we really, ask ourselves in this group, what is the capacity that these people are trying, let them share that with each other, actually plan the work. So, what are the steps that they're going to take on multiple timelines? Maybe on a timeline of the next 2 to 3 years, then a longer timeline, let's say a 5 to 7, and then longer timelines that are maybe 10 or 15 years out. And then that's kind of framing it. But then the most important piece is what we'll do in this group is we'll start to put in feedback loops. So we'll look at as they do the work, how can they learn from the work? So how can they create this iterative transformation that we've been
Mm.
talking about, so that all the time we're not just executing a strategy, but we're learning from the execution and pivoting is needed. And then the last question, which I think is probably the most important for this group to work through, is who is the we? I think a lot of times we have really limited perspectives initially until we do work in the space of compassion around who needs to be included as stakeholders. But I'm confident that as we go through this work, similar to what happened for us in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical research and development, your definition of the we continuously expands. And a lot of times, people who are working in health systems, they oftentimes don't even expand that we to the perspective of the patient. So that's already like one step further. And then if you go beyond that, you can expand that we into the patient's family, into their caretakers, into all of the support systems that need to also be in place to help people on the journey of health.
What is that? And I love that emphasis on this question, who is the we? What does that weing process look like in practice? Is that a conversation? And also, how does that become real for people?
So we in Novartis, I think, have gone on that journey the past few years. And what it's meant for us has been to build one of the largest patient engagement functions in the industry. And what that means is actually bringing patients in to the drug development process much earlier. It's something that's not happened in the past. So, for example, scientists working in oncology on breast cancer, for example, they always kind of approached that the best outcome for breast cancer treatments is for the patient not to die. But that weaning process, when you actually bring patients in, is you start to hear other perspectives that actually patients are okay with dying. What they want is the best quality of life that they can have while they're alive.
Mm,
So they don't want to be kept alive longer just to, but not be able to interact with their loved ones. And so that's where that curiosity comes in. You have to enable those connections. And for us, this is just one example, it's been fascinating to see our scientists, which are sometimes deeply entrenched in their expertise, in their science, and not often looking outside to stakeholders, to just give them access to those perspectives.
mm,
And that's the same with this diversity, equity, and inclusion in development, clinical research and development work. It's just to say, oh, what other questions do we need to be asking of the development process to make sure that there everyone belongs who needs to belong to it. And that in itself is its own transformation journey around bringing patients in, around bringing diverse voices in, and finding ways, yeah, to do that.
That process of what other questions do we need to be asking, is that I mean, is that also a, a group of leadership that come together to ask themselves that questions, like that question, like what is the process by which you um, begin to open up this question of what questions should we be asking ourselves?
So that's not my area of expertise
Mm,
within the company, but I can talk about how I see that in relation to
mm,
my work. So, um, in the space of these adaptive skills and societal learning, so not talking about the scientific piece, but trying to bring new perspectives in on the patient experience. One thing that we started to do already, actually, at the in our Development Goals Summit in October, and we'll relaunch it this year, is to use a tool called SenseMaker,
mm,
which is a tool for narrative research, to actually collect both narratives and some more quantitative data around how people, patients, so we're all patients, right? Or we know a patient, but I think we've all been patients in our lives, how they have seen adaptive skills, as outlined actually in this inner development goals framework, show up in their patient experience or not show up. And I, um, I need to collect that data, do that research now in 2024 again to get a bigger data set.
mhm,
But I think what'll be really interesting for us to see is that there is a, we already know that there's a huge gap in teaching adaptive skills to people working in healthcare, and it has created a lot of problems from the perspective of talent, of retaining healthcare professionals, of managing their stress levels, of managing their resilience. And it also then has huge patient outcomes, or huge impacts on patient outcomes. But I would like to have a more concrete data set around which specific adaptive skills, as outlined in the IDG framework, are probably most positively impactful, and also the missing in for patients as they interact with health systems, so that as we spread that information, we can segment it geographically and we can start to bring it into local markets and help people see where they could really most benefit from doing adaptive skill building
mm.
with their in their health systems. And each, health systems are structured completely differently, sometimes by country, sometimes by region, and which makes any change effort incredibly complex, and also requires you to really go global. I hate that word in a way, but this idea of global framework to local implementation.
Do you have a so recognizing that your learning is occurring in the context of a complex of many different complex systems, these kind of like global, local systems of complexity. Do you have any kind of top level strategy for dealing with that complexity?
Yes. I think I like to layer deployment at multiple levels. So I would say at the level of kind of global, vanilla content that can be accessed by anybody. Maybe vanilla is not the word, democratized content that can be accessed by everybody. That's where we leverage Coursera. So
Mm,
we're one of the first healthcare companies to put content on Coursera. Right now, we have just our first course live, but within the next few months, there'll be several more going live. Everything from um, the process of drug development at our biomedical research labs to how clinical trials are run, to how to engage the public in kind of the process of drug development. And then over time, we'll be adding more content there, including gateways for people to move into new professions in health, especially in the space of community health worker, because that's where we believe we can really support people who are in caretaking roles that are not classically structured today. You know, community health workers are a lot of times funded by different types of organizations, but they play such a crucial caretaking and bridging role in every society where they work. So we will be working with Coursera to create a path for people to become credentialed as community health workers and start working in that space. So that's kind of our global, let's say, deployment approach. And then we work with various consortiums and partners at a local level. So I talked about this work in the US. Something similar is now starting to take shape under the leadership of the EU and their Innovative Health Initiative in Europe. And it's actually a much larger consortium. It's not led by Novartis in this case, but we have a big role in shaping it. So that'll be a way that so you look for channels like this to get into certain regions, right? Riding off
Mm.
of the backs of other institutional collaborations. And then similarly, I talked about this program in sub-Saharan Africa, which is going across 10 or 12 countries. And it's also about then providing the support and the tools, but letting the people who are on the ground in those countries engage external stakeholders in the learning and then maintain momentum, or what we I like to call it sustainable learning.
Mm.
So when people go through these programs, we're not looking to, again, just upskill them, but we're looking to mobilize a network. So a lot of it is about, yeah, keeping the network and relationships mobilized and dialogue going. And that actually takes a lot more energy and effort than the initial delivery.
Mm. What does that mean, mobilize a network?
Yeah, so one example is, for example, last year we ran two cohorts of our Value Chain Academy in Ghana. And so this is a program that looks at quality and supply chain management in interest of reducing falsified medicines, of not wasting as much medicine, and actually saving people's lives. And so the people who go through the program are pharmacists or distribution centers or people really working in the supply chain. And they're not always a lot of times actually they're not even suppliers who are points of supply that are working with Novartis. So we open it up to anybody. And in the process, we do a lot of workshops where we look at practices that they might implement to improve the value chain. And so it's creating a space for that dialogue to continue after. So we might bring them in for a touch point call every quarter, for example, look at specific plans that they made for improvements and let them share with each other. And that's when the learning moves away from us kind of pushing knowledge out to more community learning, right? That's where the real transformation starts to occur.
Mm. One of the things that I'm getting from what you're sharing is that a big part of how you connect the global to the local is through partnerships. That was you know, in the
Mm-hmm.
US you partnered with the 26 universities. In Ghana you're partnering with these organizations. When you so when you think about partnerships, are there any particular um, things you look for or consider when you're looking at partnering in some domain?
Yeah, so where I am in my journey right now, I've been primarily relying on partnerships. So in Ghana, for example, also we partnered with a university, with the College of Pharmacy, to deliver this. And those are relationships that often already exist between, let's say, Novartis and these institutions. So, as the societal learning support, I'm not really necessarily going out and building those relationships
Mm.
yet. Up until now, I've been leveraging existing ones so we can move the work forward. Also, because just at the stage of where I am in my own journey, we were asked to onboard into existing pieces of work, right? But as we go forward in the space of compassionate health systems, I will be looking to create a new kind of network of people looking to bring adaptive skills into healthcare around the world. And I think that there will be a lot of people who have specific interests who will want to partner in that work. And I see them as the network, but there needs to also be a hub that holds all of that. And I don't know what that is yet. But it needs to be a hub that doesn't have a lot of industry interests. So I think, to answer your question, what I'm looking for is neutrality
Mm.
and also the ability to hold space for a lot of competing interests to, let's say, come together in learning and knowledge sharing, but also to, yeah, butt heads a little bit and develop um, new positions, etc. And that means that the hub that is holding this network needs to be very neutral in its position in order to be able to facilitate that.
Mm. And I know one of your most visible partners is the IDGs, and I'm curious how the IDG framework has helped you um, approach this adaptive development chain territory.
Yeah, so once I think I mentioned that we'd like to do this patient research, and ultimately the IDG framework will is what we're measuring against. So it gives us a language that is also itself continuously evolving of the
Mm.
adaptive or transformational skills or human skills that we want to build to enable these systems to transform. So the first piece was that it'll enable this patient research. And then as we go into, I spoke about this network that will be focusing on building compassionate health systems. As we build that, it'll also serve as the framework will serve as a language that we can come back to talk about specific interventions that are needed in specific areas. Because each kind of system or, let's say, consumer of the learning and of the work is going to need something, yeah, just slightly different. So the framework gives us that language, but also more importantly is the not the framework, but the IDG community
Mm.
gives us access to cross institutional and transdisciplinary folks who are doing similar work in other really complex systems. So it gives you the opportunity to learn, and sometimes also in health systems. I mean, I've met lots of people, and I think part of our work this year will be coming together in a more tight knit community with them around how to move this work forward and learning from each other. I mean, health systems are incredibly complex, and but there's also many other complex challenges, like such as the ecological challenges that we face, that we can take a lot of lessons from in how we lead change in those spaces as well.
Mm. And in the context of leading change in this complex infrastructure, how do you think about measurement? I'm kind of guessing that at the end of the day, you're also maybe dealing with people that need to have some sort of concrete indicator of what success might look like. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm curious about what does in the context of framing these projects and looking at their outcome and success, and how do you think about presenting that success or somehow measuring it?
Yeah, so I think each project, the measures of success are different. So I definitely do outline impact measures for each one. For example, diversity, equity, inclusion in clinical research and development is probably one of the easier ones to measure because we have quite good data available around the number of physicians with access to diverse populations actually engaging in clinical research and development, at least for the US market. So we can start to create some correlations there around impact measurement. When it comes to the adaptive skills, we are looking to measure basically in three areas. In terms of leading indicators, a lot of it is going to be focused on initially measuring people's intention to change, their actual ability to make sense and make meaning of their environment. And then as we move to more intermediate indicators, that's where you start to measure difference achieved in the systemic experience, so the experience of the patient. You start to measure that there's more resilience in the system, so actually capacity of both the healthcare providers and of the patients, and that there's a change in the sense of threat that or that it's reduced ideally. And then in terms of lagging indicators, so things that we start to see further out, and I we don't know how we'll fully measure this yet. I mean, there's some good methods out there, so I think we'll evolve off of them. But where you start to see risk reduction, improved retention of talents in healthcare, improved patient care, and also just a more solid, I guess, trusting relationship between patients and the health systems that they're engaging with.
Is most of this measurement happening through some sort of survey instrument?
Yeah, so it's not happening at all today. But
Mm,
I think will the I think the approach of kind of narrative research is one that is really interesting at this moment in time, given how AI has progressed and some of the ways
mm,
that it's now possible to extract connected threads from let's say, um, large databases of narratives.
mm,
So I don't know that we'll use a specific narrative research tool. As I said, we're playing with SenseMaker for this initial piece of work around patient experience and connection to adaptive skills. And I think we'll learn from that and go from there. So if anybody has any suggestions or ideas in this space, we're all the time thinking about how, yeah, to move this forward.
and just to clarify, narrative research is basically where you're collecting stories.
Yeah, so you ask people instead of asking them to rate things on a scale, you ask them to describe an experience. A lot of times you then ask them to assign an image or a word to that experience. And then you also ask them to put that experience into a triangular grid where you can define kind of the points. So instead of it being a linear polarity in a triangle, you have more opportunity for trade offs. So depending what you're asking people
Mm,
um, to grade against, you can ask them to take that story and trade off from three sides.
mm,
And
mm.
we use, yeah, this tool SenseMaker for that today, both internally and externally.
And I don't know if this is quite your domain or if you can answer this, but maybe you can. But I'm curious because you're dealing with learning across so many complex and intersecting domains, such as patient outcomes, learning culture, talent retention. How do you how do you approach correlating the learning that is happening in each of those sectors to have some sort of understanding, like measurable understanding that improved patient outcomes relate to like easier talent retention or something like that? How do you actually like manage you have learning in each individual system, and then there's some sort of possible correlation between those elements. And I'm curious if there's like some sort of specific approach you go about to bring that data together in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so I think firstly, the way that we have been also thinking about it is that the stories that come from the data, they are subject to interpretation, right? So part of collecting the narratives is actually to see where the narratives diverge. So the beginning, the first phase is really about discovery. So collecting stories and perspectives and seeing where maybe stakeholders from a hospital have a very different perspectives from the people running clinical trials on the Novartis side, let's just say, as an example, right? And then seeing what those gaps are. So that's kind of interpreting the data and then visualizing it, but letting, I think what's important is making that whole process really transparent to everyone who's put, who has actually provided input into it. And what we've been calling that is meta learning. So actually sticking to some principles of keeping the knowledge transparent. And when you're collecting this large amount of data from multiple sources, even when we do our own statistical
Mhm.
analysis on it to show patterns and trends, that we leave those open to everyone contributing to the meta learning to also see, if they have divergent perspectives.
Mm. I wanna,
I don't,
and
it's emergent, so I don't know how it will go, but
right.
well, yeah.
And so I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, which was the feedback loops, which I'm assuming that there's also like a meta feedback loop concept here where you're kind of approaching it, it's emergent, and then you're learning from that. And in my experience, operating at a much smaller scale, but very much with a similar pattern of, here's a territory that's emergent. We don't really know what works or what doesn't, but we have some ideas and we hold those ideas loosely, but with a very much like let's validate and learn from it orientation, and then going through cycles of feedback and prototyping. I'm curious in your experience, in your kind of career experience, having been doing quite a bit of this, are there any like clear do's and don'ts or insights into that kind of feedback loop process that maybe you hold as an understanding as you approach this way of operating in any particular project that you might be going into?
Yeah, so I've been working with a colleague, and the language that we use to talk about how we want to define the principles of doing this work is we talk about it as data justice.
Data justice.
And yeah, so what I mean is handling participant data securely, of
Mm,
course, and maintaining each participant's data privacy, but then also that the analysis and sharing of the data is done with real intentionality. So um, you can really put the data in the appropriate social context that it needs to sit in, and that when it's shared back, it's given that context, but also is transparent for all to see. So people can take it out of context, or they can go with kind of the narrative of of the context that's coming back to them. And so I think that is really the principle that I would like to adhere to with this work. That's our intention. How that will progress, I think, is going to take definitely vigilance and commitment and making sure that there's guardrails in place.
Hmm.
So let's see.
Say a little more. Maybe I missed what you're sharing there, but the how is that situated in the context of um, feedback loops and
Yeah,
the
so let's take the patient experience
mm,
as an example, right? We want to protect their. Let's just go zoom in to a small practice of I don't know, maybe they have about 200 patients and one or two physicians, right? And it's, let's say that this practice wants to work on adaptive skills for the teams serving the patients. So they start to pull some of the open source tools that we're making available somewhere down the line as part of our compassionate health systems framework. And to even touch those tools or to get access to them, they need to already engage in this narrative research. That'll be kind of the requirement, right?
mhm.
Is to actually create the feedback loop. So then um, we ask them to engage their patients, we engage the staff in the practice themselves, and we can start to see kind of the divergent narratives of where they think what the staff think versus, or the health practitioner thinks versus what patients think are the adaptive skills that need the most focus.
And
Um,
those are conversations.
um, I think we'll see how it gets implemented. Probably SenseMaker, again,
Mm,
as a tool, is the way that I would go for it. So we have good
mm,
quality data
mm,
using narrative research. And so we need to protect the individual perspectives that come into that, right? Small practice, but we also want to make those individual narratives available in the context that they're being looked at to everyone who contributed so that they can see the other stories and narratives and experiences that have happened. And then over time, you might repeat that process again at some point in the future to see how things have shifted.
mm, mm. What are you, so as we wrap up here, what are you most excited about in your role and in the possibility of building a learning ecosystem going into the future?
Hmm. I've really been thinking about abundance mindset and how a lot of these challenges that we're trying to address, they're not challenges that can be solved even in a single generation, but we have this pressure of time on us to really to address them quickly. And I I think that the best accelerator of actually getting things done in a new way is through learning. And by just removing these silos, and for example, um, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have in the topic of health economics and the way that they set their systems up for the next generation as more and more people are living longer, they're less concerned about communicable diseases and more concerned about diseases like cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease as their populations move up the socioeconomic ladder. I think that there's really an opportunity not just to learn from academics in this space, but to really bring existing institutional knowledge to people to enable them to create these compassionate health systems. So
Mm,
I'm really excited about creating spaces for that to happen. I think that our my team and my organization just plays one small role in this, but I'm hoping that some of the things that we're doing will spark some of those changes and transformational learning opportunities to occur, for dialogues to happen, and for things to yeah, for learning from each other to accelerate the pace of change in these systems towards something that is a more inclusive good for all and really equitable in the way that it supports humans.
Mm, I love that. Yeah, one of the things that I've learned, and I think maybe one of the biggest things I've learned over my time working and learning is that one of the maybe the biggest thing to get is that there isn't necessarily a clear path on how to do something. Like part of the challenge is learning how to learn. Is actually just like, well,
Mm-hmm.
how are we going to learn here? And that's some of the in any sort of emergent complex environment, that's that's one of the biggest questions you can work with. So I really appreciate the kind of getting into the nitty-gritty details of how you do that at the scale of Novartis and really operate with this like feedback loop iterative approach to working in the local systems where you're having an impact.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's actually such a good way to frame it. Is just how will we learn from the systems is really the question that I need to be leading every local discussion with.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I think that's where systems awareness tools start to become really effective because it gives you a frame for doing that. So how are we going to learn together and also sense make between the stakeholders on how we see this reality because everyone will have a different perspective.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting. It's just I don't know. There's such slow processes, but at the same time, you feel this pressure to move change quickly, and it's yeah, interesting competing pressures or to integrate, right?
It's good to what's the phrase? I think it's like make haste slowly.
Yeah. So we'll
I think
see.
that's the best way to go. Nina, thank you so much. I really, really
Thank you
appreciate
so
you
much,
taking the
Swift.
time to also just to share so openly about your own learning journey and the incredible work you're doing with artists.
Thank you. I'm really feel really lucky to be able to do it and to be learning together with so many great people on similar journeys.
Mm, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.